In 2021, he signed a $228 million contract. That same year, he still called his mother every night before bed, still lined up to buy groceries, still rode the bus as if nothing had happened. In a world where money often redefines people, Giannis Antetokounmpo is the opposite. He let the money go one way, while he himself stood still. Not because he didn't know he was rich, but because he knew exactly what couldn't be bought. What happens inside a person's mind when they have it all but actively choose not to change? And why is that choice so much harder than you think? Stay. The answer isn't as simple as you think. Before the $228 million, there was a boy without citizenship. The Antetokounmpo family, originally from Nigeria, settled in Greece in the 1990s, but for nearly 2 decades, they lived without proper documentation. They couldn't attend school normally. They couldn't open bank accounts. They didn't officially exist on any government paper. Giannis and his brothers spent their days on the streets of Athens, selling watches, CDs, and cheap souvenirs. Not to save money for a new phone, but so the family could have a meal that night. This is important to understand, and to understand correctly. Not every child who grows up in poverty becomes frugal when they become rich. In fact, the opposite is true. Psychology notes that many people who experienced extreme deprivation as children will react by compensatory consumption when they have money, as if each luxury item is proof that their past is truly over. Giannis didn't do that. And the real question is why not? There was one thing that those years on the streets of Athens had done for Giannis, not fear, but a frame of reference. When you know your starting point, when you remember the uncertainty of tonight's dinner, you have a measure that no school can teach. He knew what was enough, not because someone told him, but because he had never had it. But there was one person who shaped all of that even more profoundly than circumstances. His father, Charles Antetokounmpo, was a man who worked tirelessly his whole life without ever asking for recognition. He didn't talk much about his philosophy of life. He just lived in such a consistent way that his children observed him every day. One day, he realized that dignity lies not in what you possess, but in how you treat those around you. Giannis once said in an interview, his voice devoid of drama, "My father taught me that family is everything, not in words, in the way he lived." And this is where the story begins to crack, because Charles would never get to see his son lift the Larry O'Brien trophy on the NBA court. He passed away in 2017, 4 years before Giannis won the championship. Before that, he couldn't get a visa to the US to attend the games. Not because Giannis didn't have the money, but because there are doors that money can't open. There are lessons no one wants to learn that way. But once you've learned them, you'll never look at the question, what is money for, in the old way again. And that's exactly the kind of person who enters the NBA at 18, not with dreams of cars or mansions, but with something much heavier, more durable, and far harder to explain, a silent promise to those who had been there from the beginning. On NBA draft night in 2013, Giannis Antetokounmpo was selected at number 15. He walked onto the stage wearing a suit borrowed from his older brother because the family couldn't afford a new one for the occasion. That was the official starting point, and from there, things changed at a speed even he couldn't have predicted. In 2019, he won his first MVP award. In 2020, he won his second MVP consecutively. In 2021, he led the Milwaukee Bucks to their first NBA championship in 50 years and also received the Finals MVP award. And just before that season, he signed a Supermax contract extension worth $228 million, one of the biggest contracts in NBA history at the time. In 8 years, he went from a boy selling watches on the sidewalks of Athens to one of the highest-paid athletes on the planet. And then, nothing changed. Not figuratively, literally. For many of the early years of his career, Giannis took the bus to practice. Not because he didn't have a car, but because he hadn't seen a compelling reason to change that habit. The photo of him sitting on a Milwaukee public bus that went viral on social media wasn't because he was deliberately trying to create an image. It was because it was normal for him and unusual for the rest of us. He once recounted that when he first arrived in Milwaukee at age 18, his first apartment was almost empty. A mattress, a few sets of clothes. He would lie on the floor, stare at the ceiling, call his mother, and tell her he was okay even though he didn't know a word of English, had no friends, and no map to what lay ahead. Years later, with an 8-figure bank account, he still made it a habit to call his mother every night. Not as a ritual, but because it was something he genuinely wanted to do. The NBA environment is not lacking in pull in the opposite direction. It's an ecosystem where extravagance isn't just accepted, it's assumed to be a deserved reward. Teammates, rivals, image managers, brands, fans, all exert an invisible pressure that if you don't flaunt your wealth, you're doing something wrong. Giannis heard that pressure. He wasn't someone who didn't recognize it. He simply didn't see it as important enough to react to. And this is the most subtle part of the whole story, the most easily misunderstood. Giannis doesn't live frugally because he doesn't know how to spend money. Not because he's afraid of losing money. And certainly not because he's trying to project a humble image for the media. He lives that way because for him, that way of life doesn't need explanation. It's not a choice he has to think about every morning. It's the default. It's the foundation. It was there before any numbers appeared in his bank account. Psychology calls this identity-based behavior. Behavior stemming from identity, not from temporary goals or discipline. When you don't act a certain way because you want that outcome, but simply because that's who you are, no external circumstances are powerful enough to change it. Money comes. Fame comes. Pressure comes. Giannis stands still not because he's stubborn, but because he already knew who he was before all of that came into being. There's something most outsiders don't see when watching the NBA. Not the plays, not the contracts, but the social system that operates beneath all of that, an incredibly sophisticated system that defines what success looks like, sounds like, and more importantly, feels like. The NBA tunnel walk. The moment players get out of their cars onto the court has become a fashion event of its own. Some players hire personal stylists for each game. Some spend tens of thousands of dollars on an outfit they wear for exactly 15 minutes before changing into their game uniform. It's not mere vanity. It's the language of a community. And like any language, if you don't speak it, you become invisible in some way. Social psychology has a concept called conspicuous consumption. This theory doesn't judge consumers. It simply observes a reality in many communities, especially those whose members rose from poverty. Displaying wealth isn't arrogance. It's proof. Proof that one has escaped. That the journey was real. That parental sacrifice wasn't in vain. In that context, spending money is an emotional act, not just a financial one. And that system has very real pull. According to a study published by Sports Illustrated, about 60% of NBA players fall into financial crisis within 5 years of retirement. Not because they didn't earn enough money, but that's because they're operating in an environment where the rate of spending is standardized at an unsustainable level and nobody around them has the incentive to tell the truth. Agents earn commissions. Brands want you to spend. Friends and family suddenly appear when money is available. An entire ecosystem is built around a player's cash flow, and most arrows point in one direction. Giannis exists within that system. He's not separate from it. He attends parties. He goes to events. He knows the rules of the game. He just doesn't let those rules rewrite his priorities. There are brands he turns down even though the contract value is substantial. Not because he doesn't need the money, but because he has a very simple filtering question. Do I really want to have my name associated with this? If the answer isn't a clear yes, then it's no. That's the kind of thinking that in the NBA environment isn't as common as you might think. Because when you're young, talented, and suddenly have more money than anyone in your family history, the default pressure isn't save. The default pressure is prove that you deserve all this. And the easiest way to prove that is to spend. Giannis chose the path of not having to prove anything. Not because he had nothing to prove, but because he didn't need outsiders to validate it for him. His validation came elsewhere from people who knew him before he had anything. And those people never asked him what kind of car he drove. There was a very small moment in the 2021 NBA Finals that most cameras missed. Immediately after the final whistle, as his teammates jumped, as the crowd roared, as the confetti began to fall, Giannis stood still in the middle of the court for a few seconds. Eyes closed, lips pursed, as if he were talking to someone only he could hear. Then he opened his eyes and went to find his mother. That moment wasn't designed for the camera, and that's why it speaks louder than any interview. Psychology distinguishes two basic types of motivation: intrinsic and extrinsic. Extrinsic motivation is when you do something for an external reward. Money, fame, recognition, the gaze of others. It works. But it has an inherent weakness. It depends on something you can't control. When recognition comes, you feel good. When it doesn't, you waver. Intrinsic motivation is when the energy lies within. When you act for the meaning of the action itself, not because of who's watching. Giannis trains when no one's in the gym. He calls his mother when no one's watching. He turns down contracts without explaining to the public, not because he's trying to project an image of humility, but because he doesn't need a mirror to know where he stands. This is what psychology calls autonomy, self-control, not in the sense of independence or isolation, but in the sense that the source of behavior comes from within, not from external pressure. People with high autonomy don't need validation to act. They don't need the approval of the crowd to feel their choices are right. And in an environment like the NBA, where public attention can reshape the behavior of even the most powerful people, not everyone can maintain that. Once a reporter asked him if with that amount of money he didn't want to buy a supercar. Giannis paused. It wasn't because the question was difficult. It was as if the question came from a language he understood but didn't use. He answered that he didn't need a fancy car to feel successful. That success for him looked different. Then he shifted to another topic, calm, undefensive, without needing to convince anyone. That's a sign of someone who knows their own values well. Not because he's immune to temptation. No one is completely immune to temptation. But because he has something psychology calls value, clarity of values. When you know clearly what you value. When something truly matters, small decisions are no longer internal struggles. They become reflexes. To buy a supercar or not. The answer is no question because it doesn't serve anything he truly wants to protect. And what he wants to protect, not secrets, not complicated, is the feeling he had before he had all of this. The feeling of knowing where he belongs. Knowing who will be there when everything else is taken away. Knowing that at the end of the day, when he comes home, his value isn't measured by what he brings with him, but by his presence there. It's not some lofty philosophy of life. It's something many people have then lose when money and fame begin to replace more important questions. Giannis didn't lose it. Not because he's more special than others, but because he never lets himself forget that it's more important than everything he has. So what influenced Giannis's choice? Not financial acumen, not branding strategy, not because he read many books on minimalism, but because money came and found no void to fill. There's an English saying that doesn't need translation to understand: money doesn't change people, it reveals them. Money doesn't change people. It only reveals what was already there. For those who never knew who they were, money became their identity. For those who already knew, money was just a tool. Silent, neutral. No more power than the one holding it allows. Giannis is not a saint. He's not perfect. And his story isn't a lesson to be imposed on anyone. But it raises a question, not for him, but for the viewer. If everything external disappears, no more money, no more fame, no more, the gaze of others is what remains enough for you to recognize yourself. Giannis knows his answer. The question is, do you know yours?